The next ancestor that we're going to be studying in this course, Transmission of the Light, is Nagarjuna, a very, very revered Zen ancestor. He was more or less late 2nd century of the Common Era, and he is quite held up as a devotional figure, and he's so respected that there are incredible legends about him. It's hard to actually know much about the person himself and what he actually wrote or taught because of the adulation that's been added on. And this is not unusual. We see this also in other figures, other Buddhist figures. But we have this chapter on Nagarjuna by Keizan Zenji. I also gave you an article, a tricycle article that you could have a look at with some more information about him. He's said to be the second Buddha. That's how greatly revered he was. Although some folks take offense to that epithet for Nagarjuna because it has the potential of ignoring all the enlightened people, all the enlightened teachers that lived and taught and walked the earth in between the time of the awakening of the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, and Nagarjuna's time. Nonetheless, he is an important person for us to know about and to study. And so we have this lesson here, and reading from the Clarity translation on page 53, Kapimala, so you had a separate teaching from me about Kapimala. Kapimala answered the invitation of the Naga king. So who are the Nagas? Nagas are deities. They live in the so-called upper realms. So there in Buddhism are many realms of existence, the human realm being somewhere close to the bottom actually, but in the middle area there, because there are hell realms below us, animal realms and hell realms below us, and above us are said to be the celestial realms. And there are 31 realms altogether, and the 32nd one is the unconditioned, is Nibbana, which, as I've said before, is not a place or a form of existence at all. It is the unconditioned. But here we have the Nagas, and the Nagas are from the upper realms. They are known to be deities. They are Buddhist protectors. They are, in some Buddhist traditions, understood to have been keeping certain texts, protecting certain texts. They are associated with snakes and dragons. They look kind of like snakes or dragons. And it's said that the Buddha had very good relations with the Nagas as well. So Nagarjuna, Naga, he's related to them. He is sometimes even depicted with snakes coming out of his head as if he were Naga himself. But Nagarjuna saw that Kapimala had received this jewel from the Naga king, and he says, makes a statement and then asks a question, sort of. This is the ultimate jewel of the world. Does it have form or is it formless? And Kapimala responds by saying, you only know of it having form or not, but you do not know that this jewel neither has form nor is formless. And you do not yet know that this jewel is not a jewel. So when we hear Kapimala speaking like this to Nagarjuna, then we understand why Nagarjuna taught the way that he taught. Because he was a great philosopher, and his way of teaching and writing was using these kinds of very pithy, very taught verses and phrases And they can be a little tricky. They can be a little difficult to tease out the meaning. And but they do have meaning and they do make sense. And so in this case, what is Kapimala pointing at, as usual, and as we saw in his chapter, is pointing at mere interdependence. So the jewel does not have form, nor is it formless. It is constantly in a state of the mere temporal presence of the conditions for jewel. That's how to understand that. And the jewel is not a jewel, meaning that it's not really anything precious. Again, if we understand all phenomena as being like this, all phenomena as being mere phenomena that are part of this, interwoven into this whole scheme of interdependence, then it's not all that precious, actually. And then he goes on to teach him, however, that the Dhamma is precious because the Dhamma enables you to come to this kind of conclusion and to this kind of actual embodied experience. So Nagarjuna was profoundly enlightened at this statement, at this teaching from Kapimala, not falling over to one side or the other, or falling into this very mundane way of thinking about what is valuable, what's really valuable. So there's a little bit more of his origin story here. And we see Kapimala administering the precepts to a snake. And the snake then later shows up as a monk who is appreciative. And so again, Kapimala, although he learned his lesson about the use of spiritual powers by himself taking refuge in Ashvagosa, he then applies that to the snake in his life. And that snake become monk is the one who points him eventually to Nagarjuna. Several miles north of here, looking at the top of page 54, there is a great man named Nagarjuna who always preaches to a crowd of Nagas, and I also listen. So Kapimala went there, and Nagarjuna saw him and greeted him and said, "Why have you, a great sage, arrived here?" And Kapimala responds with a tremendous amount of humility. I think that this is very much part of this chapter and something that I really want to call out. He says, "I am not the supremely honorable one. I have come to visit this wise man." So he doesn't start out with some kind of debate or holding himself out as a teacher or asking any kind of checking question. He doesn't do any of that. He just humbly says, "Okay, I'm here to hear what you have to say." And then Kapimala thought this. Nagarjuna thought, "Oh, has this teacher attained certainty, illumined the eye of enlightenment? Is he a great sage?" So Nagarjuna is impressed by this humility. Nagarjuna wonders, oh, maybe this person really knows something, that he is so confident that he doesn't need to exert his confidence at all. And so Kapimala then says, even though you're speaking in your heart, I already know it in my mind. So again, his spiritual powers, right? He is perhaps talking about being able to, quote unquote, read Nagarjuna's mind or know what Nagarjuna is thinking. Or maybe he's just making a good guess. Either way, you don't have to believe in the powers. You could just know that what he said to Kapimala, to Nagarjuna rather, what Kapimala said to Nagarjuna applies either way, which is just take care of renunciation. Why worry about whether I'm wise or not? In other words, just try the practice. Just do the practice. And you'll know for yourself. You'll have the same confidence that I have. Knowing for yourself. And so Nagarjuna accepts the suggestion, the offer, the teaching, and is ordained and practices with Kapimala for at least 4 years, it says here, for 4 years. So Nagarjuna is also said to have very supernatural powers. And one of the things that's pointed out, I forget in which introduction, Cook or Cleary, is that we see a lot more of this kind of discussion of miraculous background and supernatural powers with the Indian ancestors. And then Kazan does much less of that when he gets to the Chinese ancestors. And it's hard to know really whether that is a reflection of Indian culture, because Indian culture has, I believe, quite a lot of that, quite a lot of reverence for miracles and magic and spiritual powers, and or whether that really just represents Kazan's feeling that the Chinese ancestors were much closer to him in time and in their forms of practice, and they were people that he related to as folks that weren't so magical, weren't that kind of special, whereas the Indian masters might have seemed to him as being so far back in the mists of time that they were folks that he didn't relate to in the same way. We don't know. In any event, there's more discussion here about Nagarjuna's teaching. And then it says on the top of page 55, the first full paragraph there are other disciplines, other traditions that consider Nagarjuna to be their predecessor. But when it comes to Nagarjuna's Buddhist teaching, only Kanadeva got the true transmission, and the rest were all schools that he had abandoned. And so there's this kind of sectarianism that's being espoused here. And again, it's hard to really know. It's just because of how much material has been attributed to Nagarjuna and the fact that he is an early ancestor, and therefore there are many lineages actually that do consider him to be one of their ancestors, one of their predecessors. And so we see Kazan perhaps taking this opportunity to associate himself and his lineage with a very, very esteemed historical person, and to try to establish some authenticity of his teaching in that way, some authority and some authenticity of his teaching by virtue of this connection. And then we see Kazan give an explanation of this teaching. Even if it is a worldly jewel, when you talk about its true reality, it is not formed or formless. It is just a jewel. Yet these jewels, looking at the bottom, near the bottom of that paragraph, these jewels are all mundane jewels. The Nanga King jewel and various other jewels, the King's jewel, etc., are all mundane jewels, not the ultimate jewel of the way. Swansha said, the whole body is a jewel. Who would you inform? The whole universe is a single bright jewel. Now that is a very famous Zen phrase. The whole universe is a single bright jewel. Again, pointing at the whole. If all things are interdependent, then they can be spoken of as the whole, even though they are still not one, not two. And similarly, we see this teaching. So Nagarjuna is most well known for Mula Madhyamaka Karika, known as the Karika really for short. Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the courses, the discourse on the middle way, or verses on the middle way. And he says that, as I said, his teachings can be quite pithy and also quite dense, hard to parse. Some people have said he's more revered than studied. Nonetheless, we see this, which I hope will show him echoing this teaching, or his actually Kazan echoing this style of teaching that Nagarjuna proposed back in the 2nd century or so. When material form is considered to be distinct from the cause of material form, it follows that material form is without a cause. So he's saying that's a mistake. Nagarjuna is saying that's a mistake. Nowhere is there any effect without a cause. That is, there is no jewel without the cause of jewel. And then again, we see Kazan say, all appears from people's own minds. So perhaps it is Yogacara that he is sharing here. So it's a good thing for us to talk about. Or is it karma? Is it just karmic action and the principles of interdependence at work that he's pointing at? Nonetheless, we're going to keep going. This is a little bit longer chapter on Nagarjuna, which again is to be expected. And then, in part because Kazan goes into this whole section on do not live secluded. And this is quite interesting. Quite interesting, this teaching. I mean, from the philosophical, you could say from the overarching standpoint of Zen practice, you cannot understand the principle of interdependence or the principle of response that is at play within this Buddha nature as it's being described here, unless you are Or you could say, you can, but it's much more difficult. You can see it on your own, this principle of responsiveness, this principle of interdependent arising and ceasing. You can see it on your own, but it's much, much more difficult than when you are in interaction with others, right? That's why, for example, we saw Kashyapa Kala Ananda. That's an example of exactly how that works, how it can be more easily seen with others when practicing with others. So, Zen has a very, very strong value for practicing in community. Very, very strong value. As somebody who practiced in Zen monasteries for years, I can tell you, you don't eat alone, you don't sleep alone, you don't bathe alone, you don't work alone, you don't meditate alone, you don't chant alone. It's all done together. All of it, the whole life. You barely have a moment to yourself to go to the toilet. So there's very, very strong value for practice in community. I was kind of sad to see that Keizan says at the bottom of toward the bottom of 56, that Dame received the true seal from Mazu, and Guishan received the transmission from Baizhang. And it was after their enlightenment that they lived alone in the mountains, which is sad. If you're enlightened, then that is really the least appropriate time to live alone. You should have compassion on beings and share. In any event, he says, if you live in the mountains while neglecting to investigate what you should investigate, that is a serious lack of spirit in the way. And then there's this next paragraph, which is a little head-scratching. If people just practice to train themselves, then they become followers, are conditionally enlightened. What is that? What is conditionally enlightened? What would that even look like? I don't understand the statement at all. They will become spoiled seed for naught. Spoiled seed means they are scorched seed, and that they cut off the seed of Buddhahood. Once again, what? The seed of Buddhahood cannot be cut off. The seed of Buddhahood, if Buddha nature is the nature of all reality, completely inseparable from either the absolute or the subjective, then how could it be cut off? That doesn't make any sense. What would make sense potentially is if he is saying that they failed to establish the conditions to realize their Buddha nature. Okay, that's okay. But to say that you would somehow eliminate your nature as a Buddha, cut off your nature as a Buddha, seems a bit misguided in this context. So then he goes on and on about living in community and practicing in community, having a teacher. And he encourages us. You have been able to hear the right teaching of the Buddha because you have planted roots of goodness. Just progress diligently. And then we have the verse. The solitary light, aware space, is always free from darkness. The wish-fulfilling jewel distributes its shining radiance. So the wish-fulfilling jewel is the way itself, Noble Eightfold Path practice. It distributes its shining radiance. Right. Its wisdom spreads far and wide. And that solitary light, that aware space, always free from darkness. Now, to me, that is a description of mind. Mind. And curiously, Cook says something quite different. He says, the orphan light. And so the orphan light, again, I think that is a reference to individual minds. An individual mind, the face before your parents were born, is the general way of thinking about it. But the individual, so here maybe, the orphan light, marvelously vast, is never darkened. So perhaps Cook is translating it in a way that makes it sound like the whole is never darkened, and therefore the wish-fulfilling way shines everywhere. That is our chapter on Nagarjuna.